you shoot Russians in the back? You being, I guess, not you personally, but the Ukrainians, sure. They achieved a military victory. They caused the Russians to withdraw from territories that they were going to withdraw from anyways in accordance with this agreement.
Okay, so thank you. So they caused them to withdraw from territories that they were going to withdraw from, meaning the Russians retreated. And it's perfectly legal to shoot somebody like that in the back that's illegally invaded your country, is it not? Are they not enemy combatants underneath the rules of and laws of armed conflict?
Why are you contesting this? Why?
Well, because it seems like a mischaracterization by you, and I want to keep you honest.
You can use your standard. I'll use the standard given to you to the Marine Corps. But if somebody is no longer
by the Marine Corps or the Kremlin,
I think it just
where are you at right now, anyway, Scott? Moscow.
Fuck you. I'll put my DD-15 up against yours any day of the week, Matt. All right.
Okay. So just
I'll
put it up against you any day of the week. Don't you ever
Sounds good, buddy.
say that again. Got it?
Mario, I'll put my arrest record up against yours any day of the week.
Scott, guys, we'll avoid. I think if we start on personal attacks, it means that we're detracting from the argument. I think it's a weak way of countering an argument. So I'll take it back. I think, Scott, I know you're based in the US. I know your stance. Some people agree with in the US. Some Americans agree with your stance. If you think Russia's winning, doesn't mean you want Russia to win. So I'll support you on that point. But I will go back to you, Matt. Matt, Scott's position on what a win would look like, what Russia's outcome will be. Not what he wants it to be. What it will be is that Russia will have Donetsk, will have Luhansk, will have Zaporizhia, will have Kherson, obviously Crimea's in Russian hands, and we'll have certain buffer zones in Kharkiv and Odessa and a few other territories, as well as denazification, which is I'll kind of avoid whether that's whether there is a Nazi problem in Ukraine. And the other one is demilitarization. So not only no security guarantees, but weakening Ukraine's military. What's your stance on what the outcome will be, in your opinion?
So I've been stating this since the start of the war. Likely you're going to see something like what we see between North Korea and South Korea. Some sort of a DMZ, maybe not a permanent peace deal that ends up coming, but a lasting ceasefire that ends up going through. I think the only thing that really falls within the realm of possibilities and logic for Ukraine to willingly give up would be the Donbass region itself, Luhansk. When you look at that area and the original location from the separatists that Ukraine went and now calls terrorists, right, and all of that other stuff, I think there's some commonalities here Scott and I can actually agree upon. That is the one place in which, my mind, it kind of makes sense for Ukraine not to worry about fighting over. Why? Because you did have a bunch of separatists that ended up rising up after 2014 and want to move and go over to Russia. And if there was an actual side that I think a lot of Americans and other people can get behind, one can actually make the argument that there was a democratically elected government inside of Ukraine at the time that happened, and that the people in the East, regardless of whether or not it was corrupt, whether or not you want to go with the election fraud and all of those other things that took place that was well documented by Europe, regardless of all of those things, the argument can be made that there was a democratically elected government and those people wanted to separate from it because you ended up having the, I don't want to call it a violent overthrow, but, a change within the Ukrainian government. So Ukraine already shares a border with Russia, and they have since the freaking Soviet Union fell. So why not give up just that little bit of chunk of terrain? Because the entire thing's leveled and ruined anyways. I already talked about the water supply over inside the Donbass is completely and totally wasted. Now, the question is whether or not Ukraine's going to be willing to do that at that point, right? Like when we look at it, is that something that the Ukrainian people are going to do? If you've actually spent time over in Ukraine, something that you'll come to understand is everybody remembers what America looked like after 9/11, where you had American flags that were just waving everywhere, right? And when you go into Ukraine and you take a look at it, what you're going to end up discovering is that there's just blue and yellow painted on freaking everything, everywhere you go. The national pride inside of that country is something that I think a lot of countries all around the world, regardless of what country you belong to, which one you think is good or bad, I think just the national pride that they have within themselves is a good thing. I state that for a reason. Because if Russia was to go and advance and take all of these different locations like Scott's talking about and what they would control after the war, you would have an insurrection problem like no other. It wouldn't go anywhere. Even down in Melitopol, for example, they have these issues that are taking place right now. In Crimea, they currently have these issues, and they've been controlling it since 2014. And so if Russia was to continue to advance, let's say, in a hypothetical world, if Russia was able to advance, you'd have those issues. And so at some point, Ukraine's also got to look and say, are we going to have that same issue over in the Donbass region? And Ukraine is going to have a lot of cleaning up to do. They're going to have a lot of mess to clean up. They have a lot of rebuilding to do. And why take Donetsk if you don't need to? If the people don't want to be there, plus most of them are gone anyways, why? Let them keep it. And I think that's about the only thing that would go on it, and likely a lasting ceasefire agreement, kind of like North and South Korea.
So, and what about security guarantees? So there is a pretty valid risk, in my opinion, that if there is no security guarantees. So first, why would Russia oppose a security guarantee? I'll ask you that question, Scott. I want your thoughts on it as well. Because if Russia, if there's troops, Western troops in Ukraine, that's not really a risk to Russia. Those troops are not going to enter Russia as long as they're like defense, missile silos in Ukraine. That's not really a risk to Russia. So, in my opinion, having troops in Ukraine, European, America will probably not accept, seems like a valid middle ground for Ukraine to have their security while giving up territory to Ukraine. Your thoughts on this, Matt, and then Scott, more importantly, your thoughts.
Yeah, I think Ukraine can and should. One, they're an own independent sovereign nation. They're allowed to partner with and do whatever they want, right? And that includes joining NATO should they choose to. But Scott even knows this. They're far away, far away from joining NATO. They were far away from joining NATO in 2022. But as far as that goes, in order to guarantee the peace, you can look at it as a security guarantee in one way. You could also look at it another way to keep Russia in check. Because like I said, they did sign their name to the Budapest Memorandum, and they violated it several different times. They even violated international law, one could say, by invading Ukraine after they illegally annexed Crimea. And so Ukraine's looking at this as a way of having something. And if Russia is not worried about reinvading Ukraine, then they really shouldn't be worried about whoever signs their name to a list and says, we will defend Ukraine, especially if those countries are as weak as Scott says, then in which case, who cares? Why would Russia be so afraid if they don't have intend on invading Ukraine any further?
So, that's just, Scott, that's the question. So I understand Russia's concern. I agree with you that Russia has concerns with NATO expansion. I disagree with Matt. We'll have that discussion afterwards. It's even if it's a sovereign country, if Mexico wants to have a pact with China and have military equipment, Chinese military equipment in Mexico, even if it's a sovereign country, US will not accept that. So I'll get your thoughts on that. But Scott, in terms of having European military in Ukraine to at least give Ukrainians peace of mind that this won't happen again as happened in 2022 and 2014, why do you think that's not acceptable for Russia?
Because Europe's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Europe is, comprises NATO. The European nations have spoken out in extremely hostile fashion to Russia even before the special military operation began. Russia doesn't trust Europe, doesn't trust their long-term intentions. Europe continues to believe that Russia needs to be weakened militarily, economically, politically. Some Europeans even speak about the breaking up of Russia as their ultimate goal and objective. So why in God's name would Russia allow forces from these nations into Ukraine? Ukraine is supposed to be neutral. That's the goal and objective here is neutrality. And you can't be neutral when you have the armed forces of nations who are openly hostile to Russia on the soil of a supposedly neutral nation.
So, Scott, the Budapest Memorandum is 6 paragraphs. Could you state in there where they agreed to neutrality and not to join NATO?
I don't have it right in front of me, so I'd have to review it. But
you need to review the 6 paragraphs that you're quoting?
I never.
First of all, I didn't quote the 6 paragraphs, Matt. This isn't a fucking court of law. It's a cute little game.
So just quickly, so Scott, the question I have for you is that I agree with you that Ukraine's neutrality is, but hasn't that ship sailed? I agree that would have been really helpful before the war, but now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, I think having a neutral country that's just been invaded is a bit difficult to achieve. Even though most Ukrainians are against the war, I think now at the beginning, and Matt, these stats kind of counter your point that Ukrainians are tired of the war. At the beginning, there was 22% that wanted to fight until they win the war. That was in 2022. The number now 70-something% that wanted to win to fight until they win the war. Now it's down to 24. And in terms of negotiating an end to the war as soon as possible, the number was 22% in Ukraine that wanted to negotiate an end in 2022. Now 70%. So the Ukrainians are tired of this war. But back to the point, Scott, is would they really accept a peace deal without some sort of guarantees that are not a risk to Russia?
Again, you're missing the point. From the Russian perspective, let me give you a little piece of historical analogy. General Krebs, who was the commander of the German garrison at the final days of the Battle of Berlin, went to General Chuikov, who was the commander of Russian forces, the hero of Stalingrad, and he said, "I'm here to offer terms of our surrender." And Chuikov said, "There will be no terms of your surrender. It will be unconditional surrender." And that's where we're at today. I mean, the Ukrainians can sit here and spin it any way they want to. We can talk about this, that, and the other thing. But unless Ukraine can somehow win on the battlefield, prevail on the battlefield, and get Europe to somehow stand up and impose economic harm on Russia through sanctions and create political difficulties for Russia to isolate Russia diplomatic around the world, Ukraine isn't going to have a vote. They voted when they decided to, violate the Minsk Accords, to walk away from the Minsk Accords. They voted when they allowed NATO to basically use them as a proxy. That's not me saying, that's not the Russians saying, it's Secretary of State Rubio acknowledges that it's a proxy war between the United States and Russia with Ukraine as a proxy. The Ukrainian defense minister acknowledged that back in 2022 and 2023. It's a proxy war. So Ukraine no longer, they've foregone the concept of, independence and sovereignty and making their own choice. Their only choice is total defeat or to accept terms in which they recognize their neutrality. And this would be not neutrality like Finland, or because Finland, remember, promised neutrality in perpetuity, but they've walked away from that. This will be a different kind of neutrality, a Russian imposed neutrality. Russia believes that they can accomplish this. Russia believes they're on the path to accomplishing this. Matt may disagree. The Ukrainians may disagree. History will tell.
So, Matt, I'd love you to respond on the point Scott has made, but also take into consideration the numbers I just mentioned, that Ukrainians seem just exhausted from this war and most want an end to it. Doesn't that make it hard for Ukraine on the negotiating table?
No, I think when you look at things and you say that, Ukrainians want to have, a peace deal or a peace agreement in order for the war to come to an end, I think most logical people would agree to that, right? But they also didn't lay out what the end terms of that would be. So when we look at surveys like that, we have to take these certain things into account. I'll trust some surveys, but I also don't, right? You have to look at the verbiage and you have to think of what people are actually thinking, what the meaning behind that is. I think Scott and I actually did come to an agreement and find some common ground here, which is going to be one, that Russia wants to impose their will on Ukraine, right? And so we both can agree to that. And so I'm glad he came out with that, because that is exactly the reason why Ukraine's not going to agree to anything without any security guarantees. And if Scott wants to ignore the facts that I brought up, like the fuel crisis and the water crisis and all of those things that are taking place and the drastic impact that's hitting like the Russian economy currently, and pretend like I didn't say those things and move on to a different subject as if their economy is doing great and Europe's is doing horrible, okay, great. That's fine. They can continue to throw meat waves at Ukraine and they'll continue to get mowed down. That's it. And so, like you and I, Scott, we agree. I'm not bringing up anything like out of context historically or anything like that. Russia wants to impose their will on Ukraine. Ukraine's not okay with that. And unless there is a security guarantee by a foreign nation that is going to ensure and keep Russia at bay, then they're going to continue fighting, because right now they have a line established. And again, it's 10 times harder fighting those dug in positions than it is to do anything else. So why not just sit there and let Russians throw meat wave after wheat wave, especially after Germany just pledged, what, $2 billion? And then you've got Canada building new factories. I believe the same thing also, Canada also just put up $500 million to buy more like weapons being supplied. So all of that continues to come. And Scott, I don't know if people have showed you, but I've seen them. I've seen the munitions that Russia is using on the front line. I've seen the crap drones that they're using. I've seen the Russians taking anti-tank mines, chipping the explosives out of them, melting them down, and pouring them into plastic water bottles and trying to use these like improvised drones to fly into Ukrainian positions. You're acting as if they're some like superior force when they're getting a buttload of ammunition and they're getting a buttload of troops from North Korea, which neither of those two things turned out well for them. Kim Jong-un was just crying the other day over this crap. They got slaughtered. Absolutely slaughtered. So by all means, if Russia wants to continue to kill North Koreans and send them to the front line to get slaughtered, if they want to continue to like chip apart freaking landmines and use that and pour that into water bottles and try to send that on drones to have an effect with fuses that aren't even made for them, let them have at it. Go for it. Everything that you speak of doesn't matter, because the truth is actually on the ground. And as you said, history is going to write itself when this thing ends.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, Kim Jong-un cried. 101 North Korean soldiers lost their lives and their bodies were brought home and treated like fallen heroes by the North Koreans. 6,000, I believe, North Korean troops were deployed into the Kursk region. 101 certainly isn't slaughtered. And the last time I checked, 80,000 Ukrainians became casualties because of their Kursk incursion. They're no longer in Kursk. So, I mean, if that's the kind of Ukrainian victory you want to applaud. You can cite anecdotal things. I'll just tell you right now, I've been to Crimea recently. I don't know if you have or not, but it doesn't reflect anything that you've said. I know people who are in Lugansk and Donetsk right now. The stores are full of food. Yeah, the water gets turned off now and then because there is a water problem. The Ukrainians have been hitting water distribution points, civilian targets, by the way, with their drones. And so the Russians are in the process of repairing them, and water will be restored. Fuel shortage, it's war times. If, I don't know what the status is today on it, but I can tell you in Crimea that cars drive. There's no problem with cars. There's heat, gas is provided to the homes. There's food in the stores. The people are doing quite well. I was just in Russia, literally got back last week, and their economy is booming. There's no economic problem in Russia. So, I mean, we could just deal with reality. There is a spin that people put on, the reality to make it look as if Ukraine has a chance. The British have been very effective in creating the keep Ukraine in the fight notion. In order to do that, you have to show that Ukraine has a chance and that Russia is somehow being diminished. I will tell you right now, I know personally the Russian commanders that are out there doing the fighting. I know the frontline commanders, the battalion commanders and such. Russia has very modern weapons. They have sufficient ammunition, and they're very comfortable with their tactics. The people that I meet aren't people that have the look of defeat in their